The echoes beneath. It had been a quiet few weeks in the town of Grimswell, nestled deep in the woods where even the wind seemed to hush at night. But for Ellie, the silence had become unbearable. She had come to this remote house after the death of her parents, a crumbling inheritance she wasn't sure she wanted, but couldn't bring herself to sell. The house was old, ancient in places, and had always felt heavy to her, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Her first night there, she had heard it, the thud. She had dismissed it at first, assuming it was the house settling. But as days passed, the sounds grew more distinct, heavy footsteps, soft whispers, and sometimes, a voice calling her name from the walls. Ellie. She told herself it was just stress, the grief of losing her parents amplifying her nerves. But that didn't explain why the house felt colder every night, or why, on the fifth evening, she found a smear of fresh blood on the kitchen floor, though no one had been there. The noises never stopped, growing more insistent with each passing night. Finally, desperate, Ellie decided to investigate the source. She began searching every room, looking behind paintings, beneath carpets, and inside the hollow spaces under the floorboards. She found nothing. No hidden passages, no evidence of anyone living there before her. Then, one night, as she sat in her bedroom, a soft rustling behind her made her spin around. In the corner of the room, a figure stood, blurred, almost translucent, like a shadow in the moonlight. Her heart froze. It wasn't human. It was something else. Its shape shifted, but she could make out enough to see a face, pale, with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched too wide, grinning with malice. Ellie. It rasped, and she screamed. But when she opened her eyes again, the room was empty, and the figure was gone. Her breath came in sharp, terrified gasps. Her fingers trembled as she fumbled for the phone, but there was no signal, just the dead silence of the room pressing in around her. Then, without warning, she heard it again, the voice. This time, clearer. Ellie, we're waiting. Frantic, Ellie ran from the room, down the hallway, into the basement. The house felt alive, its every creak a breath, its every shadow a warning. The basement was damp and cold, with only a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. But as her foot hit the first step, she froze. The stairs weren't as she remembered. They stretched further down than she thought they would. And as she looked into the depths below, something shimmered at the bottom. An old wooden door stood there, one she had never noticed before. The door was carved with strange symbols, runes that she couldn't decipher. The air was thick with something ancient, something wrong. The light above her flickered, and in that brief darkness, she heard it again. The whisper. Ellie, come. Her hands were shaking, but her legs moved of their own accord. She found herself at the door, reaching for the handle. It was cold, like ice, but she pulled it open. Behind it was a narrow hallway, leading into a cavernous, unseen space. The walls of the hallway were covered in strange, shifting symbols, ones she couldn't comprehend, flickering like flames in the dark. But the worst part wasn't the symbols. It was the smell, rotting, sickening, like something had died long ago and was still decaying in the darkness. Her breath caught in her throat. She should turn back, run, escape this nightmare. But the voice, Ellie, please. And then, she heard it. A sound from far below, like the scraping of metal against stone. Something was coming up from the depths, something monstrous. She had no time to think. She ran. As she bolted up the stairs, she tripped, falling hard onto the basement floor. The light above her flickered again, and when it came back on, the door was gone. She could see nothing but blackness ahead. The steps behind her were now too steep, too high. The light flickered once more, and she could hear it, a low, guttural growl, close and growing nearer. Ellie scrambled to her feet, panic flooding her. She ran up the stairs and into the hallway, but the house, it was changing. The walls shifted as if the house were breathing, expanding, twisting. The once familiar hallways now seemed like a labyrinth, closing in around her. No matter how many turns she made, the shadows were getting closer, wrapping around her like chains. And then, in the distance, she saw it, her mother's face. But it wasn't right. Her mother's skin was pale, her eyes wide with terror. She smiled at Ellie, though her mouth stretched too far, revealing jagged teeth. "Ellie, they're all here. Come back to us." The walls around her began to ripple, as if they were alive. Ellie screamed and turned to run, but the corridor kept shifting. No matter how fast she moved, she couldn't escape. Suddenly, she reached a door, the door to the attic. It wasn't there before, but now it stood before her, beckoning. She didn't hesitate. She threw it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the light was dim. But in the far corner of the room, she saw something that made her blood run cold. There, under a sheet, lay a body. It was her mother, but this time, the smile on her face was not one of terror. It was wide, too satisfied. Her mother's mouth was open in a scream that never ended. And standing over the body, its fingers trailing along the edges of the sheet, was the figure. The thing from the corner of her room. It turned to her, its eyes hollow, its grin stretching further. "Ellie, don't you recognize us?" Before Ellie could scream, the thing lunged. The last thing she felt was cold hands closing around her throat, squeezing the breath from her. Her body went limp, but even in her final moments, her mind screamed one question: what were they waiting for? The house fell silent again, but this time, there was no echo of footsteps, no voice calling her name. The walls, now still, seemed to absorb everything. And as dawn broke, the door to the attic creaked open, empty. Ellie was gone, and in the quiet of the house, something else began to stir. Something that had been waiting.